Hello and welcome to Just One Thing for Parents, where we offer parents a bite-sized helpful tips for how to support their children in their learning and well-being. And today I was joined by Laurie Faith. Laurie is the founder of something called activated learning, which is a classroom-based approach to teaching executive function skills. She's a researcher, author, and also a university assistant professor in Canada. And Laurie's a real expert on these skills, executive function skills. She explains what they are, and we really think together about how parents of young children can best support their kids to develop a really good foundation for the executive function skills. So it's a really brilliant episode. Keep listening. Here is my interview with Laurie Faith. So welcome, Laurie. So nice to have you here today.
Thank you, Bettina. It's nice to speak to you too.
So I wondered if we could start just by explaining a little of what the executive functions are for those who are unsure.
Sure. Well, most parents and caregivers know that executive functions include things like being attentive, paying attention, being organized, being able to start on things, maybe sort of being able to track and participate in what's going on, sort of how awake you are versus, children seeming like they're really off in a cloud or sort of lost in their own thoughts. Or some parents might think about executive functions based on something they've seen in a psychoeducational report. If you've had your child assessed for any ADHD or learning disabilities, odds are there have been some executive functions indicated on the front page of that report, things like time management, organization, planning. Really, executive functions are built from three core functions in your brain. This is your working memory, your cognitive flexibility, and your response inhibition. And all those other observable behaviors emanate from those things. A simpler way to think about what executive functions are, these are the skills that we use when we're moving out of habit and out of rote activities, when we actually have to sit up straight, wake up, and apply some problem solving to a fresh scenario that's newly challenging, that's unusual or unexpected.
Wow. So they're everyday skills that we use all the time. They're actually housed in the frontal part of the brain, aren't they? They have a very specific location in the brain and very slow to develop over childhood, aren't they?
They're slow to develop. The way that EFs develop in childhood are very similar, I think, to how the brain slowly took shape over time as we evolved into human beings. If you go into a museum of human history and see a set of skulls showing how the human skull slowly evolved into what it is now, one of the most noticeable things you'll see is the forehead starting to bulge from being what was a very flat forehead. And this really provides evidence of just how this whole structure was the most recent piece of the brain to grow, to come online, to be of service to humans. And, it's not a small structure, but we can think of it almost like a baby. It's a bit of a vulnerable structure. The rest of the brain typically sort of remains on and functioning, but during times of distress, where humans are trying to conserve resources, conserve energy, and take quick action, this is actually a part of the brain that sort of shuts down first. Right. Sort of a vulnerable part of the brain that's like the baby part of the brain, the most recent acquisition.
Right. And also, I've heard it described as like the conductor in the orchestra. It's the bit that tells the rest of the brain what to do. It's so interesting, isn't it? That comparison between it being the baby of the brain, but also the bit that's in charge.
Yeah, it's sort of unfortunate that it has such an important responsibility, it being so vulnerable and sort of temperamental.
Yes.
And what I work with lots of teachers and parents as well. And really the big message is the more calm and safe and connected and happy your child is, the more this part of the brain is accessible and is energized and is able to function and able to grow. And conversely, the more stressed and overwhelmed, maybe feeling lonely, maybe feeling anxious, especially performance anxiety, this really shuts down these executive functions. Researchers doing clinical tests will see a big dip in results in executive function performance just from an unfamiliar person standing behind a child who's doing these tests at a computer.
Wow.
The impact of stress is quite profound on executive functions.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to get to the question. The question is, what is just one thing that parents of young children can do to move their kids to being more organized, more attentive, and better at managing the demands of everyday life, otherwise known as the executive function skills? So if you could just pick out one thing that you think is like really important for parents to know and how they can support their kids in developing these really important life skills.
I love this question, Bettina, because I have a 19-year-old upstairs and I'm sitting in my 16-year-old's room. And I know you have children who are entering adulthood too. And it's like, this is what I think about all the time. And it's often, if I could go back and do one thing differently, what would it be?
Yes.
Is the age of like, oh, if only I had done that. And so just one thing for me is to know that time between birth and about age 5 or 6, before, wherever you're listening to this, wherever your children enter formal schooling and begin to take a lot of influence from other people and receive a lot of structure and support from other people. But up until that time, where parents are really the main event, where we're really sort of the star of their show, where we are the main influence, I just think it's so important for people to know that this is like game time and that there is so much that can be done. It's a bit of a sprint. I know all of parenthood is a bit of a sprint. You always feel shorthanded and like there's a ball dropping on the floor here and there as you're juggling. But if I could go back those years from birth to age 4 or 5, I would do everything I could to be as present and attentive and engaged. Like I would pile all of my resources onto that project because it's a very sensitive time for EF development. Really, at that age, this is when this part of the brain is doing it's in its most rapid period of development. It's the most plastic. It's the most adaptable. And so, there are things that you need to keep in mind during that time. Number one is just, I think, like this phone is sort of your number one enemy at this time. Right. It's almost like smoking a cigarette. People have said this before, but it really is like smoking a cigarette with your baby. Wow,
what a way of putting that. Goodness me.
I think it's it's as harmful. It's on. And because really at this age, what builds the brain is, first of all, loads of attentive and interactive engagement, really listening to children's cues, even babies' cues, and responding and adjusting and attending to the smallest nuance, noticing emotions that they're feeling and reflecting them back and understanding why they're feeling those emotions, doing all those things to stimulate and engage, singing songs together, doing clapping and rhyming and playing with their limbs and their bodies and moving them around as much as you can, accessing community supports, free programs at libraries, some of those programs where a musician will come in and there's some drumming and there's some tapping and music and maybe some animals are coming in or painting or whatever it is. I think sometimes something that parents are aware of is that that they are prone to competition. I think sometimes we steer away from going all out in this way because we think you need to calm down. This isn't a competition. I'm not trying to be better than the parent next door. It doesn't make a difference if my kid is home or if they're in a music session. I'm not steering towards bragging rights here. I just want a healthy, happy kid. And I think it's good for people to know that it really actually does make a big difference. The more that you can do, the more, especially as children begin to become literate, start learning words and communicating and expressing, the more different places they can go, the more different things they can be exposed to, the more experiences they can have. It all adds up to more semantic knowledge. So more knowledge of how the world works, more knowledge of the words that you need to talk about that, but also just more confidence in general, and more competence.
Yeah. This is quite counterintuitive, what you're saying. So what we're talking about here is how you build the foundational skills in life, these life skills that are housed in the prefrontal cortex that enable you to, organize and attend and all of those things. And they seem like very much skills that you might teach. You might sit down and teach them, say, now I'm going to teach you how to be attentive or how to be flexible. And what you're saying is, actually, that's not what matters. What matters is the everyday life of being with your child, being attentive, that really builds the foundation for these executive function skills that then makes a difference many, many years later.
Yeah, a really good example of that is what they found in terms of how you read a book to your child. Yeah. So if you were, that example you just gave where we're teaching children, for example, to pay attention and to wait and all of these things, if you were thinking that that's what you needed to do, you might say, I'm reading now. Mm-hmm. I'll take your questions at the end, but your job is to sit and listen while I read this book. And that might seem like great discipline. It's going to be hard to do, but I'm going to really force my kid to do it. And probably the parent next door is doing this and I better get on it. And in fact, what the research shows is that when you're presenting a book to a child, it should be much more of a shared experience. And what you really want is the interactive back and forth where you're almost sort of telling the story together. It's hard actually. I mean, it challenges a parent's executive functions because you're looking the book and you're getting ready to flip the page and you're watching the time and you have a million things on the go and you're thinking it's going to take about 10 minutes. You really have to calm down and inhibit all of that desire to rush and get it done, or you have to be flexible and adapt what you were thinking you were going to talk about when you were reading this book. And it's the back and forth and the interaction that really builds executive function. That's really what you want.
Wow.
So you hit the nail on the head there.
Wow. So there's this wonderful quote actually from Adele Diamond, who, is one of the leaders in this film. One of the leaders in this field, who I know you know very well. And she says in one of her papers, improving executive functions is a serious business, but there is no reason it needs to be joyless. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is something I like. When I think about that, I think about Adele Diamond, but I also think of you, Bettina, in your emphasis on connection and relationship. And this is something, it's true, that comes from the therapy world and just from the empirical world. How important actually warm, nurturing, joyful relationships are. I mean, it goes back to this idea, for me, how I think about it is this idea that the prefrontal cortex is vulnerable to stress, and that it's the very safe, secure, nurtured, happy child who has the ability to access everything that is possible in the prefrontal cortex, where it really kind of turns on. I mean, I've talked to neuroscientists who look at these neurons with really fine microscopes, and they can see traumatized children under a lot of stress. There are these potassium channels. They're like these physical channels that allow messages to be sent through neurons that actually just are closed during
really
times of stress. Yeah, it just really isn't working. It just really isn't functional and on. And sometimes I say to educators, there may be a child in your classroom who you've actually never seen in the fullness of their cognitive potential. they may always be showing you that sort of blurry, overwhelmed, confused, disorganized, maybe compensating, trying to seek some competence and some status amongst their peers by doing mischief, because they are just really unable to think clearly and perform as they would want to at school. And you can imagine these are the same kids that go home. Maybe they're around a grandparent, or they're playing with their siblings or very close, safe friends. And these are children who feel completely different in different settings. And I think everybody's felt that way. Like you come out of a meeting where it's like a stressful meeting, and you think, oh my goodness, I couldn't find my words and I wasn't articulating myself properly. And then you think, gosh, if I could say it all now from my car on the drive home when I'm listening to my favorite song and it's sunny and I have a cup of tea. Our brain really works differently in different contexts.
Wow. So what you're saying is that the research evidence, even at the neuron level, shows that stress has a really negative impact on the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. And what's inherent in what you're saying, which I think is so helpful for parents to know, is that it's not that kids or even people have the skills or don't have the skills. In different contexts, the brain is able to access those skills. And one of the key things around whether they're able to access it is to do with this joy and connection and the relationship of the person they're with.
I mean, there are some interesting studies about tennis. It's great to put your child in tennis lessons of some kind. And presumably, lots of sports and activities, not presumably, for sure, lots of sports and activities, music making is good. It helps to build the brain. But there's a big difference between tennis lessons with like a very strict coach who's just hammering balls at you and it's just rote practice over and over again, and you're stressed and worried the whole time, and someone who's making the lesson into some kind of a game, and the children's, feelings are considered, and there's an emphasis on being playful and helpful, and maybe the children feel connected to other members of a team, and it's a happy, wonderful experience. In those situations, children feel safe and comfortable and maybe a little bit bold and ready to try something really hard. Maybe a child in that setting is going to dive across the court and try out that backhand for the first time, or they're going to try to work together with a team member. They're going to do all kinds of things to move out of that rote, habitual behavior where their prefrontal cortex is kind of like off duty. The more we create happiness, it's almost like inviting children, come on forward into this structure, just sort of reaching out a hand and pulling them forward in their brain. And there's a real difference. A child, you can almost see it in their eyes, a child who's really awake. I'm saying too much, Bettina. I've got to say one last thing is that a big difference that I have noticed is just, when something is going on in the classroom and you would like to see executive functions happening, and maybe they're not, maybe children aren't taking responsibility or aren't following the timeline or being organized or attending or whatever, you can invite children into their prefrontal cortex by saying something like, this is really hard. I'm so excited to see what you're going to do. I'm so excited to see how you'll manage. And that very often just wakes them up and makes them excited, encourages their autonomy and their competence, and, versus being angry and expressing frustration and disappointment.
And that's such an important message for parents. Because being a parent is hard. Being a parent to a kid who struggles with executive functions in particular is really hard, and it can be frustrating. But if you can manage that frustration and try to bring the happiness and joy around a child, their brain's going to function more effectively.
Yeah.
That's a great message to end on, actually. Isn't it? Anything else?
It's so true. And I saved one thing that I just want to, from me to you, parents who are just starting out, it's a hard time actually in a home, in a family, when your kids are young. Maybe you've been with your partner, if you have a partner, for a while. I mean, I guess this is really more for people who are parenting with someone. But it can be a hard time in terms of your relationship with one another. And, it's kids really sometimes happen around the 5 to 7 year mark, which is when things start to get tricky. And if I could go back and do it again, I would just try as hard as I could to really stay focused on this project of parenting for young children, and sort of like really actively stop myself from being distracted by difficulties that are going on. The marriage difficulties can be really distracting during this time, and I think they need to be attended to.
Yeah.
You know, of course, put your own gas mask on before you help your children, but just to realize, I think that that's quite a threat to the amount of energy and time and focus that you're able to give children when it's like you really need to pile it on. It's really game time. You have to do everything you can.
Yeah.
You know, just to do two things at once sometimes, but remember that focusing on children is going to pay massive, massive dividends.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's the thing. That's such an incredibly important message for parents. Thank you so much, Laurie. I feel like we need to do another episode at some point and think about the older kids, because that's very different with executive functions, isn't it? But I think this message for kids, parents of younger children, is just so crucial. So thank you so much for coming on and talking to us today.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thanks, Bettina.